Welcome to the live streaming on the periodic table of communication part 2. Last week we went through the periodic table, the basics, and this week we're going to be going through the actual hosting and harvesting aspects of that, which is the advanced level of using this table. The context, just to give you one step back, as a theme, we tend to be opening up these topics in one of those 8 lenses which is above. Influence is the lens of today. So we're deep diving into the lens of how to influence people consciously using conscious communication techniques, methods, tricks and tips on doing that, and building connection, empathic connection between people. We're going to be looking at this through the middle of the session with some very concrete examples of hosting and harvesting, and I'll open up what the definitions of these mean. But before we go there, because we're using color coding, in this particular context, we're color coding blue, meaning the behavior that belongs to a particular host. Sometimes people call them facilitators. I'll clarify the difference between those two in a minute. And the color green is then referring to, from the host's point of view, the group that they're hosting or facilitating. The red is therefore the interaction between the two in the process that you have in a meeting, for example. So that's what we refer to when we color code here in this particular example. And the periodic table, as you remember from last week, is rather dense. There's a lot of things in there. At the top, we have the green, blue, red on the 3 levels: verbal, non-verbal, and intention. And this week, we're zooming in to that level below, which is the special techniques for hosting and for harvesting. And just remember that this periodic table is just a summary table that you can download. I think Anu is there in the chat. Hi, Ero as well. Anu's going to be able to share the post to which you can find the infographic with actual detailed view of all of this, which is right now a little bit too small for you to see. So you can download this on that blog website. Now, for today, what is hosting and harvesting? Okay. We tend to talk about in meetings, and this is potentially something that's cultural, specific to Scandinavia or to Nordics countries, is that often there is a very flat hierarchy. So what it means is that people like to be all equal, which is what it is, but there is a cultural, historical reason for that, which is very interesting. If you're curious about where that comes from, it's not just the cultural bucket in which Nordic countries sitting, but there's actually something called the law of Jante. You can Wikipedia that. Law of Jante, Jante, is explaining that very nicely. It's actually it's over 100 years old, and it's from a Norwegian-Danish writer who wrote about those social implicit rules of the time, where you should not be better than others, you should not talk like if you're better, think of yourself as better, be higher status than others. And this has been ingrained in the Nordic culture for a number of years, which means that there is a fundamental resistance in the Nordic countries to the idea of a hosted conversation. And it often leads to a certain resistance that shouldn't the conversation run of its own? Shouldn't everybody be equal in the conversation and things just happen smoothly on their own? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way, because you do need at some point a person who will invite and host the process of conversation, so it doesn't privilege the talkative ones and in a way give less space for the shy, introverted people. And we've seen this so many times in meetings where you have a very extroverted, for example, leader who comes in and sets the stage but takes the mic and keeps going through the whole session, interrupting people and not leaving the collective intelligence unfold. So the idea of hosting and harvesting, as opposed to facilitating or just leaving a meeting to run of its own, is to increase the chance of us thinking together. Collective intelligence is the promise of this. Without this, we just have the sum total of everybody's individual intelligence, which can be great, but is not necessarily going to mean everybody's thinking as well as we could together. So collective intelligence is why it's important to host and harvest. Now, while I'm going through these, I'm seeing the chat here, so please just throw any questions, any needs for clarity. If you want me to pause and go into one of those examples deeper, if it's unclear, please do so. I will happily go into those as they unfold. So hosting, harvesting. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you've not been into the world of the art of hosting, which is a very interesting group of people actually, it's a worldwide network of professional hosts. you'll probably think of hosting and facilitating as pretty much the same thing. So what is hosting at the moment? What we define hosting, and it's a definition that is changing. Think of the icon in the middle with the little house and the snow, which kind of hints to where we're from at the moment. The idea is think of it more like having guests at home rather than being in a business context. So hosting is about psychological safety, and it's really about bringing a feeling, it's very subjective, of safety and trust for the participants to all have a meaningful conversation, and obviously to then be able to tap into that deeper level of conversation, which allows problem solving, creative thinking, dialogue, even co-creative dialogue. So that is why you need a host, and the host is focused more on process, as we will open up in a second, whereas a facilitator is traditionally looking also at the content of what people are saying. So there's a difference there between focus on process or content of a conversation. Process might be, how are we going to do this meeting? Who's going to talk in what order? Content might be the topics that we open up and the argumentation that we use if it's a debate. Okay, so it's really important to distinguish those two. And harvesting is usually what we call the pilot and co-pilot of running a conversation. So we think of the host as the pilot and the harvester as the co-pilot. And that co-pilot is not really a secretary. Like, some people confuse the role of harvester with a secretary. Traditionally, many organizations, you'd have a secretary who's taking notes for the management team. In actual harvesting, it's a collective effort, which can be that everybody's collecting something and the harvester is coordinating that. And that is for a different purpose than a traditional secretary. Secretary is for recorded minutes, might be just the actions, whereas a harvester has agreed with the group what is the most valuable collectively intelligent output. It could be the actions, but it could also be the ideas, if it's a brainstorm, for example. So a harvester, think of the name harvester from the agricultural metaphor, they're collecting what's valuable. It might not always be the actions or decisions made, which is often what minutes are. So there's a whole art behind hosting and a whole art behind harvesting, hosting and harvesting. I invite you, if you've not ever seen them, to look into the website called theartofhosting.org. They are a collective of professional coaches, facilitators, researchers, and people really on the front line of that art of hosting and harvesting. What I'm giving you here is a very sort of short summary and highlights of what they're up to on their daily work. So what does it mean? Hosting and harvesting, it's about bringing the collective intelligence in a conversation. And now, because you have, usually in a group of people, like let's say we have a 5-person meeting and it's a Monday meeting where everybody's there to connect on the week's work. Let's make a really simple case. If you let them talk without the host, you will end up having the rhythm and the process being kind of given by the participants, and it might be that they have very different needs. So it can create some frictions and even some disengagement from that process. So what we're looking at now is the tools or the elements, which are in purple, are for the host, and the bottom ones in grey are for the harvester. We're going to start looking into them one by one, but what we're focusing on is that we're looking at that as a collection for a team called the hosting team. So host, harvester, pilot, co-pilot are running a meeting, and to do that they're going to need a few extra things to make the conscious communication work. So now I'm going to zoom into the actual iPad and show you this with a bit of note taking and doodling. So, and by the way, hi Alan, hi Aspen River, welcome. Hopefully you heard the introduction. We're going deep into hosting and harvesting today. So hosting and harvesting, zooming into that. If you've seen Simon Sinek, he's very popular at the moment in social media. He talks about why. He talks about start with why, start from the purpose level. So one of the things that you're going to need to do if you're wanting to host as opposed to just facilitate a conversation is understand and also be clear with everybody why this conversation is happening. Not all conversations need hosting. Like, you're having a catch up with your family, it might not be very welcome to host it. They might just want the chaos. It's when you want a chaotic balance, and I'll talk about this next week, what it actually means, a chaotic balance. But when you want a process to take you somewhere, like make a decision or get some planning done in a Monday meeting, then you're going to need to have a clear purpose. Why are we here? We're here, let's say this week, Monday, we're here to, as quickly and as efficiently as possible, distribute the work that we have and make some decisions on some of the key topics that have emerged this week. That could be the purpose. Now, notice that purpose is a compass, and in many organizations, you turn up to a meeting with very little understanding of the purpose. So one of the things that's worth remember is that if this is your email invite to your calendar meeting, a very nice thing for a host is to be the one sending the invite by email, and also just having a simple line of text about what is the purpose of the meeting. That's a huge thing for many people, and it's often forgotten. So a host is traditionally the one who would send the invite and formulate it. They might also, if they really push it, formulate a few green example bullet points of why each person is invited. In some organizations, it's even become a rule that if you haven't clarified why participants are there, they're allowed to not turn up, because they potentially would just be wasting their time. That's quite radical. I would actually encourage that. So a green sentence about why I'm here, why he is here, why she is here, and add that into the invite. That's a really nice little extra that you can do to bring that purpose into the visible. So a lot of what we talk about with conscious communication is just making things clear. Your intention, your purpose needs to be clear. So once that is done, it's often easy to forget the state of mind that a person turns up in. They might turn up in a state of fight. They might have had a terrible week and they're full of like complaints and blame, and they just want to come here to fight. So, what do you know of the participants? Are they coming here to fight? Are they coming here to actually talk? Or are they just coming here because they have to and they'd rather fly away? When you know that, it makes things easier. If you don't know that, it's good to check your assumption by probing before you invite people in an email, for example. And if you know that they're here and they're coming for a fight, you might even want to acknowledge that in your invite and sort of maybe add a little bit of extra, green text that would be something like, you are probably going to come here with this kind of problems, and we're going to be solving them. So you're bringing them a bit of green about their problem with a little bit of a promise of a red. And then those people might turn up in a much more positive state of mind. So then what then comes is that you have to remember that the hosting is all about psychological safety, which is very invisible. So your job is not to be the boss in this case, because a host is serving the process. So they're in fact taking a lower posture in a way of status, and they're serving the group. We often talk about making promises. We have the hosting 5 promises, which any of you might be interested to see, and we'll post later if you are. But the 5 promises of a host is sort of, I'm humbly saying that I'm serving the collective intelligence and the process. I'm not here to take over like a dictator. Quite different. And your main focus is the psychological safety. So how do we do that? Well, trust. How much trust is there in the people? If there isn't trust, how do you build trust? Well, this is where you need to have the next two elements. The safe space is really just a reminder for you to keep checking that, like a temperature that you're measuring constantly. What is the level of psychological safety? There's an excellent book on that, which I'll throw into the chat in a second. But it's really just about looking through how much freedom the people have to be there, how much trust they have, how much empathy has been in the conversations between the people, how much connection, all these things matter. So a rule of thumb I use for psychological safety and safe space is when I start a process, I do a check-in. So the check-in is kind of like a way of measuring how people are coming. So you could ask an open check-in question like, how are you feeling today? Or what's the best thing that's happened last week? Or what's your need for today's meeting? something like that. And what that does is that it gives you a calibration time to see how safe the space actually is. So that's what this little icon is about. Target is because often we have a frame, okay, we're making decisions this week. It might be that you have objectives. So this could be in the invitation, by the way, but you might have 3 objectives for today, or 3 big topics of the day, and having those as targets to help people feel the sense of progression and, you know, essentially not fall asleep in a Zoom, to actually know that we're moving, to get that feedback loop. That's important to also remember that as a host, you need to be setting with the group the targets for that conversation. Otherwise, it can easily go in circles. And then comes this very invisible thing, which I've been looking at for years and years, and I'm still baffled by how invisible it is, which is why it's an iceberg with the invisible part there, is that think of the top of the iceberg. The top of the iceberg is the actual content. So in a meeting, you can tell if it's content focused. If your meeting agenda or invitation is only a list of topics and questions, it's entirely content. There's nothing below the line, which is the process. Now, what is a process? A process of a meeting is usually going through the same stages, and depending on how deep you go, it will have a few variations, but I can draw it for you in the simplest possible way. It starts with divergent thinking. So you open your thinking on a particular topic. We're here today to talk about the planning of the week. Open the topic. How might we? So you open that topic. That opening phase is called divergent thinking. So the point of entry could be a check-in. You have the open divergent phase, and then you have a period which is often called the groan zone, which is a period of, you know, exchange, perhaps debate, or if you go deeper in conversation, dialogue, brainstorm. And then comes eventually a part which is divergent and closing the thinking. So you sort of wrap it up and you start to go for solutions and decisions. And most meetings will be able to be following those 3 basic steps. Step 1, you open with open questions, not so much judgment. And then you go through, you open the debate and you explore, and then you finally close it down. It's the host's job to know where we are on this map. And if they don't have a process, if they don't have a map, then obviously they can't, like a navigator, know where they are, and therefore they can't adjust the meeting. So it's really important that whatever you do as a host, you have a process. It might be a super simple 3-step process, like open question at the beginning for a check-in, then an exploration with a time for each person, roughly with an allocation, and then the closing thinking for making decisions with a particular way of deciding things, a process for decide, like thumbs voting or something. And just that might be enough to keep your process, but otherwise it's almost guaranteed that the meeting will take longer than you actually wanted. And that is what happens online. And this is why you get all sorts of symptoms like Zoom fatigue. I'm hearing all the time. People go, I'm so fed up with Zoom. Well, yes, because if there's no hosting of process, you will be late, or you won't finish on time what you needed to be doing. And then it's also quite frustrating. So one of the keys is having a process. It actually doesn't matter so much what the process is, as long as you have one and you try and follow it and you communicate it. That's what this is about. So make the invisible process part of the iceberg visible. Some people draw the process, others have a mural board, others can be doing it with just conversation, but in some way make it tangible. Now, I just mentioned very briefly having a way to make decisions. For example, when you get to the convergent closing phase of a meeting, well, one of the things that is often forgotten about when you host a meeting is that you are given an authority, implicitly or explicitly. So authority comes from the word author, means that you are the one who speaks and the thought is originating from you. Now, authority comes in 3 colors, obviously. From our point of view, it's not just authority, but there is green, blue, and red authority. Now, can you guess what those are? Has anybody in the chat here got any idea of what green, blue, and red authority are? Because it's related to having rules. If there is no authority, there is no rules. If there's no rules, there is chaos and there's no process. So you do need some rules, and it's rather sometimes tricky to establish those rules. So here's the thing. Let's start with red authority. Is the authority which comes with typically what we say, your charisma. It's the thing that it's your courage. You stand up and go, follow me. That's the red authority. It's sometimes useful at the beginning of stage of group formation when people are not connected or there's a crisis. You need somebody to step in and take the strong lead. That's the red authority. It's only 0 to 5% worth of your authority unless you're at the beginning of a team. Then you have the blue authority. And the blue authority is really about you and your qualification. It's your LinkedIn profile. I'm here speaking with the authority of an expert. That's my blue authority. That's because I know about this field. It's one aspect of your authority, but the most important aspect of authority from a hosting perspective is your green authority. In other words, how much the people trust you to lead them. An example of that is I was in a social experiment in the south of France in a village where we were gathering to test different group dynamics, and I was in a group of about 40 people, and the organizers deliberately put us in a tricky situation where they didn't give us a purpose, they didn't give us a process, and they just said, get on with designing this. But the purpose was very vague. There was no objective and no process, no rules, no leadership, nothing, utter chaos. And what they wanted to see is how does the group dynamic unfold? Naturally, what did I do with this knowledge of the green authority is that I decided that I was going to experiment instead of just sitting back and watching the chaos unfold, which is very predictably going to turn into friction. I decided to try bringing the green authority up. So I started to re-express what was going on in the room by saying, okay, so there's 5 people over there who are thinking that this could be done in this way with this process, and these other 3 are thinking like this. And gradually, by re-expressing, I got the trust of pretty much the whole group. When it came to the right time, I then suggested a process. I said, okay, I just pulled one from a design process similar to a sprint, and I just formulated a process right there verbally, and everybody just followed it because I had the green authority. So as a host, what matters is most of all that green authority, not so much your LinkedIn profile in blue authority or your red courage to stand up and do it. It's the timing and it's the trust that the group gives you. And to do that, you will need rules that are in some way green for others in the group. So how do you do that? We found a little hack, which is something called value rules. Okay, value rules is something that we had to develop because we were working with so many different cultures and organizations that it required us to come up with a cheat sheet of rules that everybody could actually follow. So rather than jumping in and assuming that everybody knew the same rules, we decided that the fundamental building block of a rule is the value that it's putting forward. So let's say most people need to make a decision in a Monday meeting. So they want the decision to be made in a fair way. So the value is fairness. The rule is thumbs voting. So we've connected a value that is very strong in a culture. Most companies would say they want fairness. So it's a pretty universal value. And why it's a value rule is because it connects a particular value with one rule. And we've done a collection there of about 12, which have come from very different cultures that we've been testing again and again. And these are the ones that we know are the ones that we want to use regularly. So fairness, just as a point of example, when you're coming out of that long process and that you're coming down to converge near the end of the meeting, making decisions on, okay, we're going to do this or that. Let's say we're in a Monday meeting. Thumbs voting is a way, Native American technique of making decision, which sidesteps the problem of veto that we have in European traditional Greek-based voting, democratic voting. It's quite different. It's got 3 positions, this, or this. And it's not the gladiator's kill. It's fairness is best portrayed when you make a proposal. So let's say the proposal is we're going to reschedule all of our social media calendar for this week to prioritize working on a design. Great, that's a proposal. Everybody might do thumbs up, which means yes, I support the proposal. So it's non-verbal, very quick, none of this like faffing around talking, it's just the thumb. This means yes, I support. This means I have a question which I need answered before I can support it. So you have to then come with that question formulated. So I might ask, yes, I would be supportive of rescheduling all of our social media and instead do design work if I'm able to have time today to actually reschedule our social media for next week. If that's the case, I can say yes. So it's like an additional parameter. So you can, then comes the host and the harvester. The harvester's job is to harvest that, collect that so that we can, when we re-express that proposal, everybody knows what it is and it's collected on paper or digital means. The thumbs down does not mean no. And that's the thing that's brilliant about this particular rule that I'm sharing today, is the fact that there's no veto. It means I have a better counter proposal, which is better, not just for me, but I think for everybody else as well. Now that puts a huge limitation on what people can say I counter propose to, because otherwise you end up going in circles and circles and everybody's discussing to infinity and nobody's coming up with an action because they don't have a counter proposal. So this forces concrete counter proposals. Now it might be, here's the counter proposal, let's not reschedule the social media for the whole week, let's reschedule it after Tuesday because that's the rush, and I counter propose that we're going to be keeping the schedule to Tuesday, and then Wednesday onwards we were going to do the actual design sprint. And then you do another round and everybody's thumbs up on that, and suddenly you've done your decision making with a process and a rule that feels fair. Now that's just an example. I'm not saying that's the best rule to use. I've used it in Alta University with a team of 13 academics debating, and it ended up after a few weeks having only 4 people in the team because they realized that there were way too much debates about process, and that rule on its own just changed the dynamic in a couple of weeks. So you can get a lot more collective intelligence when you have at least 1 or 2 value rules. Value rules are one way of doing it. Now you can come to that with your own explicit rules that your organization has. There's plenty of them that you can use. These are just things that we've been using as daily meetings for creative industry. Okay, now once we've seen these, then all these are just six different additional rules which are useful in a particular tricky situation. Now what are tricky situations? Example, conflicts. And by conflicts I mean both dysfunctional and functional. Dysfunctional mean that they break trust, and functional means that they build trust. Yes, that exists. Some people don't know that functional conflicts exist. They mean so good or bad conflicts, but also when you're in some cases brainstorming, some of these rules come into play. And in general, when you're also just trying to make decisions, some of these rules are so often used that we put them into these elements. So I'll go through them, and in the context this time of a conflict. And we'll go through conflict management, resolution, prevention with the periodic table at a later date. So I'm not going to go through the whole non-violent communication framework and the steps of mediation. But when you get to the end of a mediation, you get to a point where proposals and requests are made. And so when a proposal or a request is made in a typical mediation process, which can be tricky, you want to have a few filter rules so that people are able to calibrate and decide if those requests are receivable, if they're okay for the collective, or if they're just serving an individual. So here's how it goes. Imagine that now there's a conflict in the team. We're in a Monday morning meeting, and actually we haven't got to a point where the design versus the social media allocation for the week is decided, and that we have a couple of people who are making things really complicated. So let's say that those people are now coming with a request. They say, I want something to happen differently. Well, this is what they would have to make. An open request means that the request cannot be like blackmail, do this, otherwise I'll leave, or do this, otherwise I'm not being paid. I'm not going to turn up to work. That's not open. That's closed. So open, in a way, negotiable. That's what it means. Positive cannot be a punishment. So it cannot be, okay, well, if you do the social media like that, then to punish you, I'm going to stop chatting with you the whole week and I'm going to send you like angry emails. No, that cannot be. That's not positive. That's punitive. Concrete means that it has to be clear enough for people to actually touch, type, see, and in some way make sense of it. That's what concrete is about. So an example of that is we're going to shift the social media calendar. Concretely, this means that we're going to have a new pulse in our Monday software, and that pulse is going to have a job for Aspen River to do, and actually by next week with this deadline, with this particular clear job to be done. So that's concrete. Measurable means that we know if it's done. Because often what happens in meetings is that we make things unmeasurable. There's no deadline, there's no completion idea, so we don't know if it's actually done, and it drags and drags and drags. So it has to be measurable in its progress. Feedback loop, hence the speedometer icon. Realistic, that's pretty obvious. Unfortunately, as humans, we tend to be always a little bit over-optimistic with what can be achieved, and that effect can lead to a lot of stress. So realistic is just a reminder that as a host, it's your job to just bring that to the table and say, like, is this really realistic? And often what that changes is deadlines. People go, actually, no, we need an extra day to be safe. And immediate means that it has to be that the timing is done immediately. So that in most cases, decisions are made, but the date and the timelines are not made with that decision. That creates a huge amount of conflicts. We've mediated dozens of conflicts because of just this simple rule not being used. So when you decide something, even if the decision is to postpone the deadline or to have a deadline set later, that has to be done now so that everybody's clear. Otherwise, it's not a decision, it's a proposal. And then some people think it was decided while others think it wasn't, and then they get into a conflict in their internal Slack channel and they start arguing about, well, didn't you do your job? No, I didn't have a job. It wasn't a decision. Typical. So that's where you need something to do with calendars that is decided immediately and harvested now, even if it's later changed. So those are the basic blocks of a hosting team for the host. Now, the harvester, being the co-pilot, is coming in to support that. So while, if we think of the iceberg metaphor, I'm going to redraw it here. If this is process, this is the content, and this is the process, the host is focusing on the process. The harvester is focusing on the content. So in a way, that diagram, we could have just reversed them. It would have been easier with this metaphor. But the harvester is the one who's paying attention to what was said, the decisions that were made, the ideas that were created, the planning changes, and all that kind of thing. So in a virtual office setup, for example, a harvester would be the one in the project management and the calendar making sure that everything's aligned, while the host is the one sharing the process on a Zoom with perhaps a whiteboard, let's say. So it just divides the cognitive load between two people and makes it a lot more fluid to actually run a meeting. Are there any particular questions from Eero or from Alan or from anybody in the group here so far on what we've covered so far as a host of a collectively intelligent process? So harvesting. Now harvesting is, thank you Eero. Harvesting is in the color gold because it's sort of where you're symbolically you're harvesting the gold from the group. Okay, that's how I like to think of it. So the first three things about the harvester is that one of the most invisible things to a hosting team is the level of flow of a group. Okay, so now flow is something that we haven't yet gone into in great depth this week in this context, but we covered a few weeks ago a flow experiment and some theory about it, where I think Alan remembers very well being here in the streaming and watching people going out dancing in the streets of Helsinki and learning how to manage their flow themselves and not outsource their flow to another person. And in this case, in a meeting, this is what often happens. You turn up to a meeting as a participant and you kind of go like, well, entertain me, make it happen for me. And there is an outsourcing of your flow. So one of the things that the harvester can do to counter that is to pay attention to the three basic components of flow and harvest those. Let's imagine that you're checking. This is, by the way, three great things you can do check-ins for. You can check in on level of motivation, level of perceived challenge, or level of perceived skill. Now, just as a reminder, in case you actually haven't seen the flow at all, and Anna will probably put a link to the flow video in the chat here, the actual flow can be simplified in your self-evaluation to three things. Your perceived challenge, it's not your challenge, it's your perceived challenge, which is a subjective measure, perceived competence, and perceived motivation of yourself. So those three things, if let's say in the group you turn up and there's a huge drop in motivation, well, the harvester is going to be looking at that and harvesting that, at least flagging that, and maybe for later on acting on it, or bringing that back as an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. Because if the motivation is very low, it's quite likely the flow is not going to be there, and therefore that might be important to address. So those three invisibles, which are the components of flow, are really worth keeping in mind as a harvester, even though you might not explicitly be asking unless you do a check-in. The flow then leads to some other very basic invisibles, which is why they're here. They're often invisible. So one of the ones that we talk about regularly is intentions. I put an arrow because it's kind of the idea of where you're going. Now, it's an incredibly difficult question to ask a person in a meeting. What's your intention here? Most of the time, conflicts boil down to an unclear or unaligned intention between people. It's often that they just didn't clearly share their intentions. So as a harvester, one thing you can do to help collective intelligence is to harvest the intentions. For example, at the beginning of the meeting, why are you here? That's also a good check-in question. All of these golden ones can be check-in questions. Why are you here? What's your need today? What is your intention with this meeting? I need to clear my calendar because my wife's about to have a baby and I need to get home and be present. My intention is to be efficient today. Okay, great, thank you. Beliefs, that's probably the most tricky in the context of work, because it often then goes into philosophical debates. So you don't need to go into a debate. As a harvester, what's important here is to be remembering that harvesting a belief or value, it's often formulated as a value. Like, for example, if you have a cross-cultural team between Norwegians and Finns, you might have the Finns looking at a very pragmatic approach, very value-based on pragma, which is the love of wisdom and less is more and less words and just get to the point. And a Swedish member of the team that might be looking at fairness and therefore wanting a different type of logic unfolding to be able to all be on the same level of understanding and take a different route to the same decision. Those two beliefs or values might be colliding and creating a conflict. So understanding what are the underlying beliefs and assumptions, which are these two here, they work very much together. Classic assumption, listening is obeying. I'm going to go through that one again and again. It's one of my pet raves because listening can be construed as obeying. So you can say, I hear you, I can be attentive to you, I can even re-express what you've said on a... It does not mean that I agree with you. It just means that I hear and understand you. And that is one of the things that people don't write down because it's just an assumption of who owns an assumption. If we follow the principles of non-violent communication, and a lot of research done on the topic shows that an individual has to own their assumptions. So if you make an assumption that's wrong, in other words, it's your prerogative to check it. And when you apply that rule, that's one of the promises we make to each other in our team here, is that we avoid unchecked assumptions. So if there's an assumption and I didn't check it, well then it's my bad. It's not the other person's fault that I made an assumption that was wrong. And what it does is that it shifts the responsibility onto each individual to be checking their assumptions. You can't check all, but it's good to write some of the key ones down at the beginning of a meeting sometimes, or when making a decision. It's like a climbing rope in a process. It's just write those assumptions down. Those who work with business canvas and business modeling are very familiar with the importance of writing those assumptions because that's what they're measuring when they do their testing. And there's two more. As a harvester, there's lots more actually than these, but these are the ones that will get you going as a host and a harvester team. Magic wand. This is one of Anu's favorite because it's about opening questions which are in a way creative. A typical magic wand question, it would be like, let's put a how might we. It's a how might we question. How might we design this differently? How might we organize our week so that both the social media team and the design team might get the maximum done? How might we do this differently if budget was not an issue? How might we do this differently if the assumption we had checked before appears to be true? So it's about opening the thinking, suspending judgment and disbelief. If you followed our session on the 4 levels of conversation, this is one of the things that helps you go through the barriers of the chit-chat conversations and debates to go deeper into dialogue. You can use that to go past the cynicism barrier. Now, cynicism is a huge problem in many organizations. People hide behind pragmatism to actually just be blatantly cynical. And cynicism is just a symptom that you're not opening yourself up to actually possibilities. It's a justification. So magic one question can be a great way to harvest as a harvester, and as a host you can use it to check in or in an interim period in a process to open up past a barrier of cynicism, for example, and get, okay, let's imagine that we had all the money in the world, or let's imagine that everything was possible, and suddenly you open up a possibility essential for a brainstorm, useful in decision making, and for thinking outside the box. So magic one. And forgiveness, now this is where some people who are less emotionally inclined to communicate, or who are uncomfortable with their level of emotional intelligence, find it very, very difficult to express. But essentially, pretty much you can make an assumption that most human beings that you work with will have something to forgive themselves that they're not sharing. So measuring and harvesting things that might need to be forgiven, not necessarily for the group, but paying attention to what people are not forgiven themselves for, is one of those very hidden unlocking elements that, one of the hashtags I'd like to start next year, let's see, is the hashtag I forgive. I forgive myself for being this. I forgive this person for that. And the forgiveness unlocks, again, that barrier of cynicism, which we talked about earlier. So it can be a very powerful unlocking factor to put that on the table at the right time in a process, with the accord of the host. So the hosting team, host and harvester, work together hand in hand like a pilot and co-pilot to actually run a meeting smoothly and make sure that it feels like it was completely spontaneous. Like a good hosting team will make the meeting feel like fluid, effortless, enjoyable, and memorable. Now, that's quite rare in the days of Zoom fatigue. So the measure of how well the hosting and harvesting was done is the measure of how much people walk away energized and how useful were the outputs, quite simply. So there's often a lot of work to be done, and it pays to be preparing a meeting as a hosting team, just if it's anything as just an invitation email with a slight clear process that goes beyond the topics of the day. That would be a really good start. So that's the hosting and harvesting elements from the rather vastly complex periodic table, and there will be more depth in the hosting and the harvesting when I open up the lens about the chaotic lens, which I'm going to show you right now. The third one from the left is the chaotic, means the balance between chaos and order is not accidental. You can engineer that in a social group with your communication skills. That's what we're going to talk about. I like to simplify it in my mind as having process and protocols for communicating. It's not often a very popular topic, as we talked about from the Nordic countries, which like everything to be flat hierarchies, but it pays off to have process so that people can get on with the topics without being interrupted by the chaos that often becomes too big. So that's what this chaotic lens is going to be, and that's going to be next week's lens that will be coming up, so stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, are there any particular questions that I could answer, or any examples that you'd like me to dissect and analyze with the periodic table? I'd be happy to do so today. As a summary, hosting is not facilitating. Hosting is a form of process help. So harvesting is a form of collecting of the outputs for the group's benefit, not just for the leader or the individual management elements in the group. And hosting and harvesting works best together. The last thing I didn't mention is rotating. It is not necessary for a leader to be a host, and in fact I recommend it the other way around. I recommend if you have a team with a few people who are less senior, you might invite everybody to host and everybody to harvest in turn. What it does is that it creates a little bit of empathy for the difficulty of hosting. It also shows just how different styles affect it, so that if you have a process, it's easier to then make sure that we're running in the same way. A couple of organizations I could mention have something called like a stand-up on a weekly basis, and there's a process that they all know off by heart, which anybody can host. So if you have a process, it's easier to sort of hand over to somebody when somebody's ill. Whereas if you don't have a process, it relies on the person who's always doing it to do it the same way, and when they're not there, it turns to chaos. So that's another benefit of having process and a host and a harvester, is to be able to rotate, and it is really good for everybody to try doing it. And you'll see that some people are naturally more gifted at hosting, others at harvesting, and others then when they go back into the participant role, they have a bigger respect for that harvesting and that hosting role, which is actually a lot more effort, because you're serving the group in two capacities, as a participant and a process facilitator or a host. So thank you for tuning in today. There will be a follow-up on this on Thursday, where we will be going into some color coding. There's been several people asking me for color coding examples, I at the moment have chosen to color code a few public websites. There will be also quite a few people following who are interested in job searching at the moment. So I selected a job ad. I wanted to color code a job ad and see how the current jobs, in times of COVID, when people are doing a lot of recruiting online nowadays, I'm really interested in how the color coding on the influence with the periodic table elements, and I will use all of the periodic table to analyze a particular job application posting by an energy company. And unless some of you come with another thing that they would like me to color code, I'm happy to add that in, or to change it if it's even more interesting. But that's what will be on Thursday. We'll be doing a live color coding, and I'll just be highlighting the bits and dissecting sentence by sentence the copy of a website with this periodic table. So that's Thursday at 8 o'clock. And meanwhile, if you are for the first time tuning into this on YouTube, please make sure that you hit that subscribe button below, and then you can follow us on replays, not just in the live streaming in Twitch. Meanwhile, have a nice end of evening. May the green force be with all of you. Good night.